They laughed when he fell. By nightfall, no one in that town would remember how to laugh the same way again. The dust hung low over Red Hollow's main street, thick as flour in the summer heat, drifting through the gaps between wooden boards and hitching posts where tired horses shifted their weight. It was just past noon, the kind of hour when shadows shrank and men grew careless, when judgment came easy and mercy stayed quiet. Takeda stood in the middle of it, his shoulders bent with age but not broken, his gray hair tied back with a strip of worn leather that had seen more seasons than anyone watching him. He didn't belong to them, not really, not in their eyes. To the people of Red Hollow, he was just another old Apache man who had wandered too close, carrying silence like it was something valuable. No one asked where he came from. No one cared. A voice had risen earlier, sharp and certain, accusing without proof, and that had been enough. It was always enough in a place like this. Ethan Cole stood near the edge of the boardwalk, one boot resting against a post, his hat pulled low to keep the sun out of his eyes, though it didn't help much with what he was seeing. He had come into town for supplies, flour, coffee, maybe a new length of rope, and found something else instead, something that settled heavy in his chest, like a storm that hadn't decided whether to break. Takeda didn't argue. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. The old man didn't raise his voice, didn't point fingers, didn't try to defend himself in a language most of them wouldn't have listened to anyway. He just stood there, steady as dry earth, holding something small in his hand. A loop of leather, darkened by time, barely visible unless you were looking for it. Ethan wasn't sure why he was. Maybe it was the way the old man's fingers curled around it, careful, like it mattered more than anything else in that moment. Around them, the town watched. Some from the shade of the saloon porch, others from behind dusty windows, a few leaning on rails with arms crossed, faces set in that familiar expression, half curiosity, half indifference. Sheriff Briggs stood not 10 feet away, his badge catching the light, his jaw tight like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. But he didn't move. No one did. The air felt still, too still, like the whole town was holding its breath without realizing it. Ethan shifted his weight, the wood creaking under his boot, and for a second he thought about stepping forward, saying something, anything. But the moment passed the way moments do out here, quiet, unnoticed, gone before a man can decide who he wants to be. Takeda's eyes lifted then, not to the crowd, not to the sheriff, but straight to Ethan. And there was something in that look. Not fear, not anger, something older than both. Something that didn't ask for help, but remembered it. Already walked. Ethan pushed himself off the post and stepped down from the boardwalk, boots hitting the packed earth with a dull sound that seemed louder than it should have been. No one stopped him, but a few eyes followed, cautious, measuring. Sheriff Briggs shifted slightly, clearing his throat as if to remind everyone that authority still stood in the street, even if it had not spoken when it mattered. Ethan did not look at him. His attention stayed on Takeda, who now stood alone, the crowd beginning to thin in that slow, uncomfortable way people drift apart when they do not want to think too hard about what just happened. A woman pulled her child closer and disappeared into a shop. Two men muttered something under their breath and turned away. The laughter from earlier did not return. It never did, not quite the same. Ethan stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the lines in Takeda's face, deep and weathered like canyon walls carved by years no one else could count. There was no anger there, no demand, just patience, the kind that did not come from waiting, but from understanding how long things took to change. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words felt small here, like they would not carry far enough to matter. Takeda's hand shifted slightly, and the leather loop slipped just enough for Ethan to see it clearly now. It was not just worn. It was familiar. The shape, the way it was braided, the faint mark pressed into its surface like a memory that refused to fade. Something stirred in Ethan's mind, distant and unclear, like a voice heard across water. He frowned, trying to place it, but it stayed just out of reach. Takeda noticed. Of course he did. The old man's gaze dropped briefly to the leather, then returned to Ethan's face, and for a brief moment, something passed between them that no one else in that street could see. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. Then Takeda nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging something unspoken, and turned toward the edge of town where the land opened wide into hills that held their own kind of silence. Ethan watched him go, the sound of distant hooves brushing the edge of hearing again, a little clearer this time, carried on a breeze that smelled like sage and coming night. He did not know what was approaching, not exactly, but he knew one thing with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. Red Hollow had already made its choice. By nightfall, it would have to answer for it. The sun dragged itself lower across the sky, stretching long shadows over Red Hollow like fingers that did not belong to anyone in town, and with every inch it moved, the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker, harder to breathe. By late afternoon, the usual sounds had thinned out. No hammering from the blacksmith. No laughter spilling from the saloon doors. Even the horses tied along the posts shifted less, their ears flicking toward the open land beyond town, as if they heard something their riders could not yet understand. Ethan Cole remained where he was longer than he intended, watching the empty stretch of road where Takota had disappeared hours before. He told himself he was waiting for nothing, that a man passing through was no concern of his, but his boots did not move, and that unsettled him more than anything he had seen earlier. Sheriff Briggs eventually stepped down from the boardwalk, the weight of his badge seeming heavier now, though he tried to carry it the same way he always had, with quiet authority and just enough distance to avoid real responsibility. He stopped beside Ethan without looking directly at him, eyes fixed on the horizon where the hills rolled out in faded gold. "You planning to stand there all day, Cole?" he asked, voice low, controlled, like he did not want the question to carry. Ethan did not answer right away. He kept his gaze forward, squinting slightly as the light shifted. "You planning to pretend nothing happened?" he said finally, his tone flat, not confrontational, just honest in a way that made people uncomfortable. Briggs exhaled through his nose, a short breath that carried more weight than words. "It is handled," he replied, though the hesitation before the words gave them away. Man like that should know better than to wander into a place like this. Ethan turned his head then, just enough to look at the sheriff, and for a brief second, something sharp passed through his eyes. "Or maybe a place like this should know better," he said. The sheriff did not respond. He just adjusted his stance and walked off, boots slow against the wood, leaving Ethan alone again with the silence that was no longer empty. As the light faded toward evening, the first sound came clear enough for anyone paying attention to hear. Hoofbeats. Not rushed. Not scattered. Steady. Measured. One set at first, then another, then more, building in a rhythm that did not belong to cattle or travelers passing through. Heads began to turn. A man stepped out from the general store, wiping his hands on his shirt, pausing mid-motion as the sound reached him. A woman at the window froze, her fingers still on the curtain she had been about to draw. The town was listening now, whether it wanted to or not. Ethan felt it settle into place inside him, that same quiet certainty from earlier, only stronger now, clearer. This was not chance. This was not coincidence. The land itself seemed to hold its breath as the sun dipped closer to the horizon, painting the hills in deep orange and shadow. Then, along the ridge line just beyond the last buildings, shapes began to form. Dark against the light, still at first, then moving with purpose. Riders. Not one or two. Many. They did not rush forward. They did not shout. They simply appeared, one after another, filling the ridge in a line that stretched farther than anyone in Red Hollow could count at a glance. No one spoke. No one needed to. The message was already there, written in silence, carried on the wind, settling over the town like something that had been on its way long before anyone realized they should be afraid of it. Ethan took a slow breath, his hand resting near his side, not reaching for anything, just steadying himself as he watched the ridge fill with figures who did not belong to Red Hollow, but now stood above it, patient, waiting. And in that moment, it became clear to him that whatever had begun in the dust that afternoon had not ended when the crowd walked away. It had only just found its way back. No one in Red Hollow moved to meet them, and that was the first mistake. The riders remained on the ridge as the last edge of sunlight slipped behind the hills, turning them into silhouettes against a fading sky, still and composed in a way that made the town feel smaller than it had that morning. Ethan Cole counted without meaning to, his eyes tracing the line as it stretched farther than he expected, 10 becoming 20, 20 becoming more, until counting stopped making sense and only the presence remained. They were not spread out like travelers or drifting like a passing group. They held formation, spaced with intention, each rider placed as if the land itself had decided where they belonged. A low wind moved through the valley, carrying the faint scent of sage and leather, and with it came a quiet understanding that settled over the town like dust after a long ride. This was not a visit. This was an answer. Sheriff Briggs stepped forward into the street, his boots slow but deliberate, the wooden buildings behind him casting long shadows that reached toward the open land, as if trying to hold something back. His hand hovered near his belt, not gripping, just resting there, unsure of what authority meant when faced with something like this. He cleared his throat, louder this time, the sound cutting through the silence but not breaking it. "State your business," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance, though it sounded thinner than he intended. The riders did not respond. Not immediately. They did not shift or lean or show any sign of reacting to his words. They simply remained, watching, waiting. Ethan felt that waiting more than anything else. It was not empty. It had weight, like something measured in time instead of distance. Then, from the center of the line, one rider moved. Slow. Intentional. The figure guided his horse down the slope, not rushing, not hesitating, each step placed with a certainty that drew every eye in town to him. The rest stayed where they were, forming a quiet wall along the ridge, neither advancing nor retreating. As the lone rider approached, the details came into view. The braids woven with care. The calm posture. The kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be understood. This was a man who carried authority without raising his voice. He stopped just outside the edge of the street, far enough to show respect, close enough to be heard without effort. His gaze moved across the town, not searching, not judging, simply seeing. When his eyes passed over Ethan, there was no pause. But when they reached Sheriff Briggs, they held for a moment longer, not in challenge, but in recognition of the role he claimed to stand in. "We are not here for your town," the man said, his voice steady, clear, shaped by years of speaking only when words mattered. "We are here for one man." A ripple moved through the gathered townspeople, quiet but undeniable. Eyes shifted, shoulders tightened. No one needed to ask which man he meant. Ethan felt it again, that pull in his chest, stronger now, anchored to the image of Takoto walking away hours earlier, alone, carrying something no one else had tried to understand. The rider's gaze did not leave the street as he continued. "He walked through your land today. He left carrying what you gave him." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper beneath them, something that did not accuse yet left no room for denial. Sheriff Briggs straightened slightly, forcing his voice to hold. "There is no trouble here now," he said, though the statement sounded like it was meant more for himself than anyone else. The rider inclined his head just enough to acknowledge the words without accepting them. "Trouble is not always loud," he replied. "Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it waits." The wind shifted again, brushing through the town, lifting the edges of coats and stirring dust along the street. Ethan took a slow breath, his eyes moving from the rider back to the ridge, to the line of figures who had not moved at all. They did not need to. Their presence was already enough. And standing there, between the town he knew and the silence that had come for it, Ethan understood something he had been trying not to see since midday. This was not about what had happened. It was about what had been allowed to happen. And now, the waiting was over. The silence stretched longer than anyone in Red Hollow expected, and that was the second mistake, because men who were used to noise often misunderstood what silence meant. It was not hesitation. It was not uncertainty. It was patience, and patience had a way of revealing things people thought they could keep hidden. Ethan Cole felt it settle deeper into his chest, pressing against old memories he had not touched in years, the kind that came back slowly, like shapes forming out of darkness. When the light shifted just enough, the rider in front remained still, his horse calm beneath him, as if both understood there was no need to rush what had already been set in motion. Behind him, the line on the ridge did not break, did not shift, did not show even the smallest sign of restlessness. They were not there to threaten. They were there to witness. Sheriff Briggs shifted his weight again, the leather of his belt creaking softly in the quiet, and for the first time since he stepped forward, there was something uncertain in the way he held himself. "You said you are here for one man," he replied, his voice tighter now, trying to regain ground he had already lost. He left. There is nothing more to settle. The rider's gaze did not change. A man does not leave what is done to him behind, he said calmly. He carries it. And so do those who watched. The words moved through the town like a slow wind, touching each person differently, but leaving none of them untouched. A few people lowered their eyes. Others stood straighter, as if defiance could cover what they felt rising underneath. Ethan did not move. He could not. The memory had finally found its way through. The leather loop. The pattern pressed into it. He had seen it before, years ago, hanging from a nail inside a small cabin far from any town, where his father had kept the few things he never spoke about. Ethan could see it clearly now, the way the old man had turned it over in his hands late at night, staring at it like it carried something heavier than its weight. He had asked once where it came from. His father had not answered, just said, "Some debts do not get paid with money." Ethan swallowed slowly, the realization settling in with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. His eyes moved back to the rider, then beyond him, to the ridge, to the people who had come not with anger, but with something far more difficult to face. Truth. Takoda had not been just a man passing through. He had been part of something larger. Someone who carried meaning the town had refused to see. Sheriff Briggs opened his mouth again, but the words did not come as easily now. "What do you expect from us?" he asked finally, the question sounding less like authority and more like a man searching for a way out of something he could not control. The rider's expression softened just slightly, not with sympathy, but with understanding. "We expect nothing that was not already yours to give," he said. "We ask for the man who believes he has done no wrong to step forward, to stand in the open, the way he stood earlier today." The request hung in the air, simple and impossible at the same time. No weapons drawn, no threats spoken, just a demand for honesty in a place where honesty had not been welcome hours before. The town did not respond. Not at first. The weight of the moment pressed down, heavy as the heat from earlier in the day. Only now it carried something colder beneath it. Ethan felt his hand tighten at his side, his thoughts turning inward, tracing the line between who he had been and who he might still choose to be. Around him, the people of Red Hollow stood frozen in that space between denial and truth, each one waiting for someone else to move first. But no one did. And in that stillness, it became clear that the hardest part of what had begun was not facing the riders on the ridge. It was facing themselves. The silence did not break, but something inside it shifted, like the first crack in ice that no one hears until it spreads beneath their feet. Ethan Cole felt it before he saw it, a quiet change in the air that pulled his attention away from the ridge and back into the town, into the faces of people he had known for years but had never really looked at this way before. Men who had laughed earlier now stood with their jaws tight, their eyes avoiding the center of the street, as if the ground itself held something they did not want to acknowledge. A boy near the general store clutched his mother's hand, his gaze moving between the riders and the adults around him, searching for something steady and finding none. Sheriff Briggs remained where he was, but the confidence he wore like a second coat had begun to slip, showing the weight underneath. Ethan's thoughts moved again to the leather loop, to the memory of his father sitting by the fire, turning it slowly in his hands, the glow of the flame catching on its worn edges. He remembered the way his father's voice had sounded that night, low and distant, as if speaking to someone who was not there. "Some men carry honor in ways you cannot see," he had said. "And if you ever cross one of them, you better hope you understand what you have done before it is too late." Ethan had not understood then. He did now. His eyes lifted toward the ridge again, then back to the rider before them. And for the first time, he saw not just a man, but a line that stretched far beyond this moment, connecting past and present in a way that could not be ignored. The rider waited, giving the town the space to choose, not forcing, not pressing, simply holding the moment open. That made it harder, much harder, because no one could claim they were pushed. No one could say they had no choice. The responsibility sat squarely where it belonged. Ethan took a slow step forward, the sound of his boot against the dirt drawing a few glances, small at first, then more as people realized someone had moved. He did not rush. He did not look around for approval. He simply stepped into the open space where Takoda had stood earlier that day, feeling the weight of that position settle over him like something borrowed and long overdue. Sheriff Briggs turned sharply at the movement. "Cole," he said, a warning in his voice, but not a strong one. Not strong enough to stop what had already begun. Ethan did not look at him. His gaze stayed on the rider, steady, matching the calm he saw there with something of his own. "He did not do anything wrong," Ethan said, his voice clear, carrying just enough to reach the edge of the street and no further. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The words landed where they were meant to. A murmur moved through the crowd, uncertain, restless, but no one stepped forward to challenge him. Not yet. Ethan continued, the memory guiding him now, filling in the spaces he had not understood before. "That man you are looking for," he added. "He once saved a life that mattered more than anyone here knew." He paused, letting the truth settle, not forcing it, just placing it where it could not be ignored. "My father's life." The words changed something. Not in the riders. They remained the same. But in the town. Faces shifted. Eyes lifted. The story they had told themselves earlier in the day began to crack, not loudly, but enough to let doubt in. Sheriff Briggs hesitated, his authority caught between the past and the present, unsure which one held more weight. Ethan stood where he was, the center of the street no longer empty, the space no longer owned by silence alone. He had stepped into it, not as a hero, not as a man seeking to prove anything, but as someone who finally understood what standing still had cost. And in that moment, the choice that no one wanted to make no longer belonged to the town as a whole. It belonged to each person, one at a time, starting with the man who had decided he would not look away again. No one expected the second man to move, and that was why it mattered when he did. It was subtle at first, just a shift of weight near the edge of the crowd, a pair of boots scraping lightly against the dirt as if the ground itself had grown unsteady beneath him. Ethan did not turn right away, but he felt it, the same way he had felt everything since the riders appeared, like a thread being pulled tighter through the fabric of the moment. Then the man stepped forward, slow, uncertain, his hat held low in his hands instead of on his head where it belonged. It was Thomas Avery, a ranch hand most folks barely noticed on a good day, the kind of man who kept his head down and his words to himself. Tonight, he did neither. He moved into the open space beside Ethan, not close enough to stand shoulder to shoulder, but near enough that the meaning was clear. The crowd reacted in quiet ways, a breath drawn here, a glance exchanged there, the ripple of attention shifting once more. Sheriff Briggs watched him with a tightening jaw, as if each step taken by another man chipped away at something he could not hold together anymore. Thomas did not look at the sheriff. He kept his eyes forward, fixed somewhere between Ethan and the rider, his voice coming out rough but steady when he finally spoke. "He asked for water," Thomas said, the words simple, stripped of anything unnecessary. That is all he did. The statement hung there, heavier than it should have been for something so small. A request. A moment. Something any man could have answered without thinking. Yet no one had stepped forward then. Thomas swallowed, his grip tightening on the brim of his hat. "And we treated him like he did not belong here," he added, quieter now, but not backing away from it. Ethan felt something shift again, not in the riders, not in the land, but in the town itself, like the first piece of a wall being removed, exposing what had been hidden behind it. The rider inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the words, not praising them, not condemning them, simply accepting them as part of what needed to be spoken. The line on the ridge remained still, unchanged, patient as ever, but the air between the town and the hill no longer felt as heavy as before. It had changed shape, just enough to let something through. Sheriff Briggs stepped forward again, but this time there was no authority in the movement, only urgency, a need to regain control of something that was slipping away with every word spoken. "That is enough," he said, his voice sharper now, but not stronger. "We are not going to stand here and—" He stopped, the sentence breaking apart before it could finish, because even he could hear how it sounded, how it no longer fit the moment he was standing in. Ethan turned his head slightly then, not fully, just enough to let the sheriff see that he was no longer alone in the center of the street. "You asked what they expect," Ethan said quietly. "Now you know." The sheriff held his gaze for a second, then looked away, the answer settling in whether he wanted it or not. Around them, more eyes lifted, more shoulders shifted, the weight that had kept everyone still beginning to loosen its hold. No one rushed forward. No one spoke all at once. But something had begun, something that could not be undone now that it had been set in motion. The truth, once spoken, had a way of finding its own path, moving from one person to the next, asking the same question without ever raising its voice. Who would stand next? And in that quiet, with the riders waiting and the town slowly waking to what it had done, the answer no longer felt as impossible as it had just moments before. The third movement did not come from strength, and that was what made it impossible to ignore. It came from the quietest place in the crowd, near the far edge of the boardwalk where a lantern had just been lit, its soft glow barely touching the ground beneath it. A woman stepped forward, older than most, her back slightly bent but her step steady, each one placed with the kind of care that came from knowing exactly what it cost to take them. Her name was Margaret Hale, though few had spoken it with much attention in recent years. She kept to herself, ran a small kitchen behind the general store, and rarely involved herself in anything that carried risk. Tonight, she did. Ethan noticed her before anyone else did, the faint scrape of her shoes against the wood catching his attention as she moved down into the street, joining the space that had once belonged only to silence. She did not stand beside him or Thomas. She stopped a few feet away, leaving room between them, as if understanding that what they were doing did not require closeness, only presence. Her hands were folded in front of her, fingers intertwined in a way that suggested both restraint and resolve. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried, shaped by years of speaking only when something truly needed to be said. I saw him this morning, she said, her eyes fixed not on the riders, but on the space where Takoda had stood. He came to my door before the street filled. He did not ask for anything but water. She paused, the memory settling into her expression, soft but unshaken. I gave it to him. The words moved through the town differently than the others had. They did not carry defense. They did not carry explanation. They carried truth in its simplest form, and that simplicity left no room for argument. Margaret lifted her gaze then, not toward the sheriff, not toward the riders, but toward the people who had stood where she had chosen not to stand earlier. He thanked me, she added, her voice steady. And he told me something I did not understand at the time. A slight breeze moved through the street, brushing the edge of her dress, stirring the lantern light behind her. He said, "The measure of a place is not how it treats the strong, but how it remembers the quiet ones." No one spoke. The words settled over Red Hollow like something placed carefully where it could not be moved. Ethan felt them land in him, deeper than anything that had been said so far, because they did not accuse. They revealed. Sheriff Briggs lowered his gaze for the first time, his shoulders tightening as if the weight he had been avoiding had finally found its way onto him. On the ridge, the line of riders remained unchanged, but there was a shift in the way the moment held itself, less rigid now, less distant. The man at the front inclined his head again, this time slightly more, not in approval, but in recognition of something being restored. Ethan glanced at Margaret, then at Thomas, then back toward the town, and he saw it clearly now. The pattern, not of what had happened, but of what was being undone. One voice had not been enough. Two had not been enough. But three had begun to change something that could not be forced any other way. The truth was not arriving all at once. It was being carried, one person at a time, across a space that had been left empty for too long. And standing there, with the night settling in and the ridge still lined with watchers who had not moved, Ethan understood that the town was no longer being judged by what it had done that afternoon. It was being measured by what it chose to become now. It was the fourth movement that changed everything, and it did not come with sound. It came with absence. A man stepped out from the crowd slowly, his boots dragging slightly against the dirt as if each inch forward carried more weight than the last, but what marked him was not his presence. It was what he left behind. His hat remained on the rail where he had been leaning, forgotten, like something he no longer had the right to carry. His name was Daniel Reeves, a man known in Red Hollow for speaking loudly when others stayed quiet, for standing firm when it was easy, but never when it was hard. Tonight was different. He moved into the open space, stopping several feet from Ethan, Thomas, and Margaret, his eyes fixed on the ground for a long moment before he finally lifted them, not toward the riders, but toward the empty space where Takoda had stood. The town felt it immediately. Not what he was about to say, but what it meant that he had stepped forward at all. The rider watched him without expression, without judgment, simply waiting as he had waited for all of them. Daniel swallowed once, then spoke, his voice uneven at first, but gaining strength not from confidence, but from necessity. "I was there," he said. The words did not need anything else, but he gave them more anyway, because truth, once begun, had a way of asking to be completed. "I said nothing. I told myself it was not my place." He paused, the silence pressing in, but he did not step back. "I was wrong." The admission settled deeper than any accusation could have. It did not point fingers. It did not defend. It simply stood, clear and unprotected. Ethan felt something in the town shift again, not just loosening this time, but opening, like a door that had been held shut for too long finally giving way. Sheriff Briggs did not speak. He could not. The badge on his chest no longer carried the weight it had before, not because it had changed, but because the moment had. Authority had been replaced by something quieter, something harder to ignore. Responsibility. The rider inclined his head once more, and this time, there was a subtle change in the way the line on the ridge held itself, not relaxing, but no longer rigid. The waiting had been met, not with force, not with resistance, but with something far more rare. Acknowledgement. Daniel lowered his gaze again, stepping back slightly, not retreating, but making room, as if understanding that what had begun with him was not meant to end there. Ethan looked around then, slowly, taking in the faces that had once been part of a single, silent crowd and now stood separated by something invisible but undeniable. Some still looked away. Some held their ground in quiet defiance. But others, more than before, carried the same weight Daniel had just set down. The truth had moved through them. It would not leave easily. The rider finally spoke again, his voice calm, unchanged, but carrying a different tone now, one that no longer asked, but concluded. "The man you met today carries the memory of your town with him," he said. "But what he carries tomorrow will depend on what you have chosen tonight." The words did not linger. They settled. And then, without another command, without any signal that could be seen or heard, the rider turned his horse slightly, not away, but enough to show that the moment had reached its end. On the ridge, the line began to shift, not in retreat, not in defeat, but in completion, like something that had come to witness and found what it was looking for. Ethan stood where he was, the weight in his chest no longer pressing, but steady, grounded in something he had almost forgotten existed. Around him, Red Hollow did not cheer. It did not celebrate. It remained quiet, but it was no longer the same silence. This one held something different, something earned. And as the night settled fully over the town, with the last light fading and the riders slowly becoming part of the land again, it became clear that nothing had been taken from Red Hollow that evening, only returned. Not by force, not by fear, but by the simple, difficult act of choosing to stand where it mattered.